The morning sky stretched wide and endless, painted in shades of gold and pale blue as the sun slowly climbed over the horizon. At the airport, the bustle of travelers filled the air with a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and hurried footsteps. For most, this was just another morning. For Flight 227, scheduled from Chicago to Los Angeles, it was supposed to be an ordinary journey. 4 hours in the sky, no turbulence expected, and smooth weather ahead. Inside the terminal, passengers gathered near Gate 14, waiting for boarding. Among them was a young girl named Emily, no more than 9 years old, with curious eyes that seemed to take in everything. She clutched a worn toy airplane in her small hand, its blue paint chipped from years of play. At her side was her mother, carrying a backpack stuffed with snacks and coloring books. Emily was quiet but observant, her gaze fixed on the window where the massive silver aircraft stood waiting. To the other travelers, Emily looked like any ordinary child about to fly. Few noticed the way her fingers traced the toy plane's wings, or how her eyes lit up as ground crew wheeled luggage beneath the belly of the aircraft. Flying fascinated her. Not just the idea of soaring through clouds, but the mechanics, the mystery of what kept hundreds of tons of metal gracefully suspended in the sky. Her father had been a pilot once, and though he was no longer with them, he had left her with stories, knowledge, and a passion she carried in her heart. "Ready, sweetheart?" her mother asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Emily nodded, her gaze never leaving the jet. "One day, I'll fly one of those." Her mother smiled faintly, though her eyes softened with sadness. Maybe one day? Boarding began soon after. Passengers lined up, handing over boarding passes and filing into the narrow tunnel leading to the aircraft door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of recycled air and fresh coffee. Flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles, directing them toward their seats. Row 9 was halfway down the plane, close enough to the front to feel important, but far enough back to blend into the sea of travelers. Emily slid into the window seat eagerly, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Her mother settled beside her, buckling both their seatbelts as the last of the passengers trickled in. Around them, life unfolded in little snapshots. A businessman in row 7 already had his laptop open, fingers typing furiously. A young couple in row 10 whispered to each other, sharing earbuds. Across the aisle, an elderly woman carefully tucked a rosary into her purse before folding her hands in her lap. Flight 227 was a microcosm of humanity, a collection of strangers bound together by chance and destination. In the cockpit, Captain Harris leaned back in his seat, flipping through a checklist with his co-pilot, Mark. Harris was a seasoned flyer, a man whose calm presence reassured even the most anxious passengers. Mark, younger and more energetic, had an easy smile that hid his nerves. "All systems green," Harris said, ticking off the last box. "Weather's clear across the Midwest." "Should be a smooth one. Music to my ears," Mark replied. "After last week's turbulence over Denver, I'll take boring any day." They chuckled, unaware that fate had scripted something far from boring for this flight. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane's engines roared to life. Emily's heart thudded with excitement as the aircraft began to taxi down the runway. She gripped her toy plane tighter, mirroring the real one's movements as it turned toward the takeoff strip. The sound grew to a thunderous crescendo, and suddenly the plane surged forward, pressing passengers back into their seats. "Here we go," Emily whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The ground fell away, and the world tilted. Skyscrapers shrank into toy blocks, cars into ants, until the city itself became a patchwork quilt of streets and rooftops. Clouds loomed ahead, soft and inviting, as the jet climbed steadily higher. Passengers adjusted their headphones, ordered drinks, and flipped through magazines. The familiar routines of air travel set in, comforting in their predictability. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and the crew moved briskly down the aisles with practiced efficiency. Coffee poured, snacks distributed, trays collected. Laughter bubbled from one corner of the cabin, while snores rose from another. At 30,000 feet, the world below seemed irrelevant. Inside Flight 227, life existed in its own suspended bubble. Emily leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the endless blue. Her mother handed her a juice box, but Emily was too entranced to drink. She imagined what it must be like in the cockpit, the switches, the levers, the glowing panels of light. She pictured her father's voice explaining the controls, the way he used to when he'd come home from long trips. In her mind, she wasn't just a passenger. She was part of the flight. "Don't stay glued to the window the whole time," her mother teased gently. "Try to rest a little." "I don't want to miss anything," Emily replied. Flying is the best part. Around them, passengers seemed content. The businessman finally closed his laptop and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The couple in row 10 laughed softly at something on their shared screen. A child further back cried briefly before being soothed to sleep. Everything appeared normal, perfectly ordinary. But sometimes the extraordinary hides in the ordinary, waiting for a moment to break free. High above the earth, in the cockpit, Captain Harris adjusted the autopilot and stretched his arms. He reached for his water bottle, took a sip, then pressed a hand briefly to his chest. A flicker of discomfort passed over his face, too subtle for Mark to notice at first. Harris cleared his throat, forcing a smile, and turned back to the controls. "Smooth as glass up here," he remarked. "Let's hope it stays that way," Mark said, jotting a note on the log. In the cabin, Emily closed her eyes for a moment, still holding her toy plane. She didn't know why, but she whispered softly to herself, "Fly safe." The words vanished into the hum of the engines, unnoticed by everyone else. The journey stretched onward, miles ticking by invisibly beneath them. The sun glowed bright through the windows, casting long stripes of light across the cabin floor. It was, by all appearances, just another flight. Yet within the quiet rhythm of air travel, destiny was preparing its stage. Because before Flight 227 reached Los Angeles, something would happen that no one, not the captain, not the crew, not the passengers, could ever have imagined. And when it did, all eyes would turn to row 9. The hum of the engines was steady, almost soothing, as Flight 227 cut through the open skies. In the cockpit, the autopilot held course with precision. Captain Harris leaned back slightly, loosening his tie and stretching his legs. It had been a long week of flights, but this morning it felt different, almost too calm, too routine. He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced at the co-pilot beside him. "Mark, you ever notice?" Harris said lightly. "The smoother the flight, the more you feel like something's bound to happen?" Mark chuckled, flipping through navigation charts on his tablet. "You sound like my grandmother. She used to say quiet waters hide the deepest currents." "Maybe she was right," Harris replied with a faint grin, though his hand drifted to his chest again, pressing against a dull ache that had been nagging him since takeoff. He brushed it off as indigestion, nothing more. The intercom buzzed with a call from the cabin. A flight attendant requested an update on estimated arrival time for an anxious passenger. Mark answered calmly, reassuring the crew they were on schedule. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Yet beneath the hum of machinery, fate waited patiently. Minutes later, without warning, the ache in Captain Harris's chest sharpened. He winced, his vision blurring briefly. Mark noticed the sudden stiffness in his posture. "You okay, Captain?" Harris tried to wave it off. "Fine. Just need a—" His words cut short. His hand jerked toward the controls as his body slumped forward. The sound of his headset clattering against the console echoed in the small space. "Captain!" Mark shouted, lunging to steady him. Panic surged through him as he shook Harris's shoulder. There was no response. The captain's face had gone pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. Mark's heart raced. He snapped the intercom switch. "Medical emergency in the cockpit. I need assistance now." In the cabin, the announcement crackled through the speakers, catching passengers mid-conversation. Drinks were paused mid-air, magazines lowered. Confusion swept across the rows as whispers rose. What did he say? Medical emergency? Back in the cockpit, Mark struggled to pull Harris upright, laying him against the seat. He reached for the oxygen mask stored above and secured it over Harris's face. The captain's chest moved faintly, but his eyes remained closed. "Stay with me, old man," Mark muttered through clenched teeth. His mind raced through the checklist drilled into him during training. Pilot incapacitation procedures. He knew them by heart, but knowing wasn't the same as doing, not at 30,000 feet, with nearly 200 lives depending on him. The cockpit door swung open, and Sarah, the lead flight attendant, rushed in. Her eyes widened as she saw the captain unconscious, his body limp. "Oh my God," she gasped. "Is he?" "He's breathing, but barely," Mark cut in. "Get the medical kit and call for any doctors on board. Now." Sarah nodded and dashed out, her heels clicking against the floor as she hurried down the aisle. Passengers turned in their seats, eyes following her as tension thickened in the cabin. Mark's hands trembled as he steadied the controls. Autopilot was engaged, holding altitude, but he knew he couldn't rely on it forever. Landings, emergencies, turbulence. All of it required two pilots. Alone, the margin for error shrank dangerously. He radioed air traffic control. "This is Flight 227. We have a pilot down. Repeat, the captain is incapacitated. Requesting immediate priority for emergency procedures." There was a pause before the controller's voice came through, calm but edged with urgency. "Flight 227, Roger. Confirm you are the only active pilot?" Mark's throat tightened. "Affirmative." In the cabin, Sarah's voice echoed over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical situation with our captain. If there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please make yourself known immediately." A few passengers rose nervously, one man identifying himself as a paramedic. He was ushered toward the front, his bag slung over his shoulder. Others craned their necks, anxious to see what was happening. The calm bubble of travel had burst, replaced by whispers of dread. Emily sat up straighter in row 9, her toy plane resting in her lap. She didn't fully understand, but she could sense the shift in energy around her. Her mother squeezed her hand tightly. "It's okay, sweetie. They'll take care of it." But Emily wasn't so sure. Up front, the paramedic entered the cockpit, his face grim as he checked Harris's pulse and vitals. He shook his head slightly. "He's alive, but his condition is critical. We need to land as soon as possible." Mark swallowed hard. "Easier said than done." The paramedic glanced at him, realizing the weight of the situation. "You're alone?" "Yeah, and we're a long way from any major airport." For a moment, silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the steady beep of instruments and the shallow breaths of the unconscious captain. The enormity of the situation pressed down on Mark like a weight. A commercial jet, hundreds of souls on board, and one pilot standing between them and disaster. Back in the cabin, fear spread like a virus. Passengers whispered urgently. Some prayed aloud, clutching hands and rosaries. A toddler began crying, setting off a chain reaction of unease. Sarah tried to reassure them, her voice calm but strained. "We are in touch with air traffic control. The co-pilot is fully capable of handling the aircraft. she said. But even as the words left her lips, she caught the doubt flicker in the passenger's eyes. Emily's gaze shifted from the anxious faces around her to the cockpit door that had just closed again. Her heart pounded, though she couldn't explain why. Something inside her told her this was more than just an emergency. Something told her she might be needed. Meanwhile, Mark's voice crackled over the radio again. "Control, this is Flight 227. I'll need step-by-step assistance for emergency landing procedures." "Repeat, I am requesting guidance." "Copy, Flight 227, came the reply. "We're clearing runways and preparing for your approach. Maintain current heading. You are now Priority 1. Mark wiped sweat from his forehead, gripping the yoke tighter. His mind replayed every lesson, every drill, every story of pilots who had faced the unthinkable. He wasn't supposed to do this alone. Behind him, the paramedic muttered, "Do whatever it takes." "Lives are depending on you," Mark nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. His eyes flicked briefly to the captain slumped beside him, then back to the glowing instruments. "This isn't how it's supposed to go," he whispered. At that moment, the aircraft jolted, a bump of turbulence shaking cups and rattling overhead bins. Gasps erupted from the cabin, and for the first time since takeoff, the passengers of Flight 227 truly understood. Their fate hung by a thread. The first wave of panic rippled through the cabin as Sarah returned from the cockpit, her expression tight, though she tried to mask it. Passengers caught it instantly. Fear has a way of sensing fear. She forced a professional smile, but her trembling hands betrayed her calm words. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice rang out over the intercom, "our captain is experiencing a medical emergency. He is receiving care, and our co-pilot is in full control of the aircraft. Please remain calm, stay seated, and keep your seatbelts fastened." But calm was already slipping through her grasp. Row by row, whispers turned into anxious murmurs. A businessman who had once been glued to his laptop now stared blankly at the seat in front of him, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. A mother rocked her infant nervously, humming a shaky lullaby. A teenage boy muttered into his phone, trying to connect to Wi-Fi, desperate to send a message that wouldn't go through at 30,000 feet. "Did she say the captain's down?" An elderly woman gasped, clutching the hand of the stranger beside her. "Yes," came the hushed reply, and the co-pilots flying alone. The word spread like wildfire, jumping from row to row until the cabin buzzed with dread. The once ordinary flight had become a prison of uncertainty. Near the back, a young man with headphones tugged them off, his voice sharp. "Are we in danger? Someone needs to tell us what's happening." His outburst drew attention, emboldening others to speak. Soon voices overlapped, demands for answers, accusations of secrecy, pleas for reassurance. Sarah hurried down the aisle, her palms raised. "Please, everyone, remain calm. The situation is under control. We have professionals assisting, and air traffic control is guiding us." Then why did she look so scared? A woman whispered to her husband, just loud enough for Emily in row 9 to hear. Emily's small hands tightened around her toy plane. She watched the faces around her, pale, wide-eyed, straining to mask their fear. Adults were supposed to be strong, she thought. Adults were supposed to know what to do. But here, in this suspended metal tube above the earth, even the grown-ups were crumbling. The turbulence returned, a sudden jolt that rattled overhead bins and sent a coffee cup tumbling into an aisle. Gasps erupted as passengers gripped their seats, some crying out in alarm. A child screamed, and soon another joined in, the sound slicing through the already fragile atmosphere. Emily's mother leaned close, whispering, "It's okay, honey. Just some bumps." Planes do this all the time, but Emily wasn't fooled. She had spent too many hours on flight simulators, listening to her father's patient explanations. She knew the difference between routine turbulence and the sharp, uneasy jolts of a plane that wasn't being guided with steady hands. At the front of the cabin, Sarah conferred with the other attendants. Their voices were hushed but urgent. "We need to keep them occupied." "Distractions, anything?" One nodded. "But how?" "They can feel it. They know something's wrong." And something was very wrong. Behind the cockpit door, the paramedic continued to monitor Captain Harris, whose pulse remained faint, his breaths shallow. He shook his head grimly at Mark. "He needs a hospital now." Mark gripped the controls tighter. "Working on it," but his voice betrayed the weight of holding 200 lives in his hands. Sweat trickled down his temple as his eyes darted across the endless array of switches and glowing indicators. The plane was steady for now, but each passing minute stretched his nerves thinner. Back in the cabin, conversation spiraled into speculation. What if the co-pilot passes out too? Someone asked. Planes can fly themselves, right? Isn't that what autopilot's for? Another countered, though the doubt in her tone betrayed her own disbelief. "No, they need someone to land it," said a man who claimed to have read about aviation once. His words sank into the air like stones, adding to the weight pressing down on the passengers. In row 12, a woman whispered tearfully into her phone, recording a message. "If anything happens, I love you." Others closed their eyes, clutching rosaries, wedding rings, or simple crosses drawn in the air with trembling fingers. It wasn't chaos yet, but it was close, a fragile order balanced on the edge of breaking. And then came the silence. Not real silence, for the engines still hummed and the seatbelt chime still dinged occasionally, but a tense, suffocating quiet as fear settled like a heavy fog. Everyone was waiting, for news, for reassurance, for the inevitable. Emily sat very still, her toy plane resting in her lap. She thought of her father's words. Flying is knowing what to do when things go wrong. Anybody can fly when the skies are clear. Her small heart thudded faster. She looked around at the adults, crying, whispering, panicking, and realized something strange. She wasn't as afraid as they were. Maybe because she didn't see only danger. She saw a problem, and problems had solutions. Her mother noticed her calm face and tried to smile, though her eyes brimmed with worry. "You're very brave, sweetheart." Emily's lips pressed into a line. She didn't feel brave. She just felt ready. As the plane jolted again, louder this time, panic spiked once more. Someone shouted, "We're going down," though nothing of the sort had been said. Fear twists words into daggers, and in that cabin, every rumor cut deeper. Sarah rushed back with the intercom. "Please, everyone, remain seated. The co-pilot has everything under control. We are preparing to descend safely." But no one believed her anymore. Emily took a deep breath. She hadn't spoken yet, but something inside her whispered it was almost time. Almost time to say the words no one expected to hear from a 9-year-old girl. In row after row, fear thickened into despair. Parents kissed their children's heads. Friends gripped each other's hands. Strangers whispered final prayers. The unspoken truth was everywhere. If the co-pilot failed, none of them would leave this plane alive. And in the middle of it all, a child sat quietly in row 9, clutching her toy plane, her eyes steady, her heart waiting for its cue. Because when hope finally seemed to vanish, her voice would rise, and it would change everything. A cabin felt like a cage of silence, broken only by the low hum of engines and the occasional clatter of an overhead bin shifting in turbulence. Fear sat heavily on every seat, pressing down on passengers who tried to mask their terror behind shaky smiles or whispered prayers. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, had just finished another attempt at calming the passengers when another jolt rattled the plane. A woman screamed. A man cursed under his breath. Parents pulled their children closer. Even the bravest faces now carried cracks. It was in this moment of despair that a small, clear voice pierced the noise. "I can fly." Heads turned sharply toward row 9. Emily stood on her seat, her toy plane clutched tightly in her hand. Her cheeks were flushed, her voice high but firm. "I can fly the plane," she repeated, louder this time, as if daring anyone to challenge her. For a moment, the tension broke, not with relief, but with disbelief. A nervous chuckle escaped from somewhere near the back. A few people shook their heads, muttering. "Sit down, sweetheart," someone said gently, trying to brush it off. But Emily didn't sit down. Her eyes burned with determination, far too serious for a 9-year-old child. "I mean it," she said. "I can fly it. Please, let me try." Her mother pulled her down quickly, her own face pale. "Emily, stop. This isn't a game." She smoothed her daughter's hair, her hands trembling. "Everyone is scared. Don't make it worse." Emily looked up at her with pleading eyes. "But I can do it, Mom. Daddy taught me." You know he did. The mention of her late father silenced her mother instantly. She swallowed hard, torn between grief and disbelief. The surrounding passengers began whispering, some dismissing Emily outright, others looking at her with curiosity. The businessman in row 7 leaned back, muttering, "Great, now we've got a kid claiming she can fly. That's just what we need." But across the aisle, the elderly woman who had been clutching her rosary studied Emily closely. "She's not joking," the woman whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else. Another jolt shook the plane, stronger this time, sending a ripple of panic through the rows. A drink toppled, spilling across the floor. Gasps rose again. And then Emily shouted, her small voice carrying with startling authority. "If we don't do something, we're going to crash. I can help." Her words froze the cabin. Even Sarah stopped in her tracks. The clarity, the conviction, it was unlike anything a child should have been capable of. Sarah approached slowly, kneeling beside row 9. "Sweetheart," she said carefully, "this is very serious. Flying a plane isn't like a game. It takes training." Emily met her gaze without flinching. "I've been training," she said simply. "Every day since I was 5. My dad was a pilot. He taught me everything. I know the cockpit. I know the controls. Please, let me help." Sarah blinked, startled by the certainty in Emily's tone. She looked to Emily's mother, who was shaking her head furiously, but her lips trembled. "It's true," her mother admitted in a whisper, as if confessing a secret she had never meant to share. Her father, before he died, he taught her everything. Flight simulators, manuals. She knows things even I don't understand. A murmur swept through the nearby passengers. Some scoffed, but others leaned in, desperate for hope. "Are we really going to trust a child with a jet?" Someone asked. "Do we have a choice?" Another countered. Sarah's pulse quickened. She glanced back toward the cockpit door, where she knew Mark was struggling alone. The words of the paramedic echoed in her mind. He needs to land soon. For a long moment, indecision held her captive. She was responsible for the safety of everyone on board, and now the possibility that salvation rested in the hands of a 9-year-old girl. Emily squeezed her toy plane, her knuckles white. "You don't have to believe me," she said softly. "Just let me try." The sincerity in her voice struck Sarah harder than the turbulence had. She stood, her heart hammering, and picked up the intercom. "Mark," she said quietly into the headset, There's something you need to hear." There was a crackle of static, then the weary voice of the co-pilot. "Go ahead," Sarah hesitated, then glanced at Emily, who nodded firmly. "There's a child on board," Sarah said slowly, "who claims she can fly the plane. Her father was a pilot." She says she knows the controls? A stunned silence followed. Then Mark's incredulous reply. Did you say a child? Yes, Sarah confirmed. But she seems serious. You need help. We're out of options. Another pause, longer this time. Finally, Mark exhaled. Bring her to the cockpit. Gasps filled the cabin as Sarah relayed the instruction. Emily's mother clutched her daughter's arm. No, she's just a little girl. But Emily gently pulled free. Her eyes shone, not with fear, but with purpose. Mom, she whispered, Daddy always said I'd know when it was my time. I think this is it. Tears welled in her mother's eyes as she cupped Emily's face. Be careful, she choked. Emily nodded. With her toy plane still clutched in one hand, she followed Sarah toward the cockpit. Passengers craned their necks, watching in stunned silence as the small figure walked past them, her steps steady despite the chaos around her. Some murmured prayers. Others scoffed. But all eyes followed her, as if drawn to the spark of hope she carried. When she reached the cockpit door, Sarah bent down. Are you sure about this? Emily nodded. I was born for this. The door opened with a hiss, and Emily stepped inside. The dim light of the cockpit bathed her face as she stared at the maze of switches, buttons, and glowing screens. Most passengers would have seen only confusion, but Emily's eyes lit with recognition. She took a deep breath. Show me the controls, she said. Mark swiveled in his seat, disbelief still etched on his face. But he saw something in her gaze, something calm, something steady, something he desperately needed. All right, he said quietly. Let's see what you can do. And for the first time since the captain had collapsed, a sliver of hope returned to Flight 227. The cockpit door closed behind Emily with a heavy click, shutting her away from the murmuring crowd of passengers. In front of her stretched a wall of instruments, glowing screens, blinking lights, rows upon rows of switches. To most, it looked like an incomprehensible puzzle. But to Emily, it was familiar, like walking into a room she had visited countless times in her imagination. Mark, the co-pilot, was pale with exhaustion. Sweat dripped down his temple, and his hands trembled as he tried to stabilize the aircraft. The autopilot was engaged, but turbulence continued to buffet the plane, and his mind was scattered between the failing captain, the panicked passengers, and the daunting task of landing alone. He turned in his chair to stare at Emily, disbelief clear in his eyes. You're really 9 years old? Emily nodded. Almost 10, she added softly, as though the extra year might make her claim more believable. Mark shook his head. Flying a jet isn't like playing a video game, kid. Emily's chin lifted. I know, but it's also not impossible. My dad was a pilot. He taught me. He showed me the systems, the checklists, everything. I practiced on simulators every weekend. I know how to fly. Mark's instinct was to laugh, not out of cruelty, but sheer disbelief. Yet when he looked into her eyes, something stopped him. They weren't the eyes of a child caught up in fantasy. They were steady, clear, and frighteningly certain. He hesitated, then motioned toward the empty captain's seat. Sit. Emily climbed up, her small frame dwarfed by the massive chair. Her feet barely touched the floor, but her hands reached the yoke with surprising confidence. She ran her fingers over the controls, like one tracing the keys of a well-worn piano. Mark watched, a strange unease stirring in his chest. Okay, he said slowly. Tell me what you see. Emily's eyes darted across the panels, scanning them with practiced precision. Altitude 30,000. Heading 270. Autopilot's holding steady. But look, she pointed to a flashing indicator. The hydraulic pressure on System B is dropping. You'll lose partial control if it fails. Mark blinked. She had spotted it instantly, something even he had nearly overlooked in his panic. You actually know this stuff," he muttered. Emily nodded firmly. "Dad made me memorize everything. He said if I was going to dream of flying, I needed to know the real thing, not just the fun parts." She looked at him. "I can help, but you have to trust me." Mark exhaled, torn between logic and desperation. No protocol in aviation allowed a child in the cockpit, let alone at the controls. But protocol had already failed them. The captain was unconscious. Medical help was hours away, and they were running out of time. He picked up the radio. "Control, this is Flight 227. Be advised. We may have an unconventional situation here." The controller's calm voice replied. "Go ahead, 227. Mark hesitated. "I have a 9-year-old in the cockpit. She claims she's trained. Knows the systems. Honestly, she might be our only shot." Silence crackled through the headset. Then, incredulously, "Say again?" Mark's voice hardened. "You heard me. I need guidance, but I'm not doing this alone. She's in the captain's seat. We're going to attempt this together." Another long pause. Then the controller sighed. "All right, Captain. If that's what it takes, we'll talk you both through this." Emily smiled faintly, her confidence unshaken. She adjusted the yoke slightly, feeling the resistance. "It's like Dad's simulator," she whispered. Mark turned to her. "Okay, Emily, let's see what you've got. Tell me how you'd start descent planning." She didn't even hesitate. "Check fuel status. Verify weather conditions. Calculate top of descent at 3 times the altitude plus 10. At 30,000, that's 90 plus 10. Start down about 100 miles before destination." Mark stared at her, stunned. She wasn't reciting blindly. She understood. "Unbelievable," he muttered. But Emily wasn't done. She pointed at another display. "ATC is giving vectors. We'll need to reduce speed before descent. Set throttles to idle at the marker. Flaps 1 notch when speed drops below 250. Mark followed her instructions, more out of instinct than faith. The aircraft responded smoothly, as though reassured by her steady voice. For the first time since the crisis began, control didn't feel like it was slipping away. Emily leaned forward, her small hands gripping the yoke. "We can do this," she said softly, almost to herself. "I know we can." Back in the cabin, passengers craned their necks, waiting for news. Whispers spread. The little girl was in the cockpit. Some scoffed in disbelief. Others clung to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she was more than a child with a dream. Emily's mother sat frozen in row 9, her heart waging war with itself. She remembered the nights her husband had sat Emily on his lap, showing her diagrams of airplanes, explaining systems she herself barely understood. She remembered the hours Emily spent on simulators, her small hands steady on the joystick. And she remembered her husband's words. One day, she'll surprise the world. Now, that day had come. In the cockpit, Emily adjusted her headset. "Control, this is Emily. What's the runway heading?" There was a pause on the line. Then, the calm voice replied, "Runway 27 left. Wind 250 at 12 knots. Visibility clear." Emily nodded. "Copy that." Her voice was clear, crisp, professional. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. "All right," he said, forcing calm. "Emily, you're flying this bird. I'll handle radios and checklists. Just keep it steady." She nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yes, sir." For a fleeting moment, Mark allowed himself to believe. The aircraft began its slow descent, engines throttling back. Emily guided the yoke with care, making small, deliberate corrections. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't guessing. She was calm, methodical, like someone who belonged there. Mark watched her, torn between awe and disbelief. How could a child carry herself like this? How could she hold steady while seasoned adults around her crumbled? And yet, here she was, a small girl with a toy plane in her pocket, guiding 200 souls through the sky. Mark's throat tightened. For the first time since the captain collapsed, he allowed himself to whisper the words he hadn't dared before. We might actually make it. The cockpit buzzed with the sound of alarms and the rhythmic hum of engines, a strange symphony of chaos and control. Emily sat in the captain's seat, dwarfed by the massive chair and towering instruments around her. She looked impossibly small, yet somehow she fit, her hands steady on the yoke, her gaze fixed on the glowing horizon displayed on the primary flight display. Mark glanced at her again, still trying to process the reality. A 9-year-old girl was sitting in the most critical seat of the plane, guiding it as though she belonged there. His instincts screamed it was madness, but the steadiness in her movements whispered otherwise. "All right, Emily," Mark said, his voice tight. "You've got control. But listen to me. I won't let you do this alone. We're a team now. You understand?" Emily nodded, her eyes still locked on the screen. "I understand. My dad used to say the best pilots never fly alone." Mark felt his chest tighten. Whoever this girl's father had been, he had prepared her for this moment in a way no one else could have. The radio crackled. "Flight 227. This is Denver Center. We're tracking you on radar. Confirm your situation." Mark picked up the headset, exchanging a quick glance with Emily. "Denver, we've lost our captain due to a medical emergency. I have limited support in the cockpit. We're attempting an emergency descent." He paused, then added quietly, "I also have unconventional assistance." Emily leaned toward the microphone. Her small voice came across clear. "This is Emily. I'm flying with First Officer Mark. We need vectors for descent and approach." There was a beat of silence, as though the entire control tower was holding its breath. Then the calm, professional voice returned. "Roger, Emily. Maintain heading 270. Begin descent to 18,000. Reduce speed to 250. Emily nodded, her hands adjusting the throttle smoothly. The engines groaned as the massive jet began to nose down gently. Mark's eyebrows rose. "Not bad. Most rookies yank it too hard." Emily gave the faintest smile. "Dad said smooth hands save lives." Back in the cabin, the passengers shifted restlessly, every bump of turbulence feeding their terror. Word had spread quickly. A little girl was flying the plane. Some refused to believe it. "She's probably just pretending," muttered the businessman in row 7. They'd never let a child near the controls, but the elderly woman with the rosary shook her head. "No, she's different. You can feel it." Emily's mother sat silently, gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles were white. Every few seconds she closed her eyes, whispering a prayer. She wanted to protect her daughter, to run down that aisle and drag her back. But she also knew, deep in her soul, that Emily belonged up there. In the cockpit, Mark opened the laminated quick reference checklist, flipping through pages. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice steadied as he read aloud. "Okay, Emily. Hydraulics are still dropping. That'll make the landing rough. What's your plan?" Emily didn't look up. "Use System A to supplement. If it fails, we'll need manual trim. We'll keep flaps minimal to reduce strain. Landing will be fast, but we can do it." Mark blinked. "You've studied emergencies too?" Emily shrugged slightly. "Dad said real pilots prepare for everything that can go wrong. He made me practice the scary stuff more than the easy stuff." A lump formed in Mark's throat. This girl wasn't just reciting, she was thinking like a pilot. "All right," he said, "then let's get you set up." speeds dropping to target. Flaps 1. Emily reached for the lever, her small hand firm as she lowered it with precision. The wings adjusted with a deep mechanical groan. The plane shuddered in turbulence, jolting sideways. Gasps echoed faintly from the cabin behind them. Emily tightened her grip, correcting gently. "Easy," Mark said. "I've got it," Emily replied, her voice calm. She steadied the jet back onto course, her face illuminated by the glow of the instruments. Mark stared. He'd flown with seasoned co-pilots who didn't have her composure under stress. "Where did you get nerves like that?" he muttered. Emily didn't look away from the controls. "My dad always said, when you're scared, the plane can feel it. So I don't let it." Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. As the aircraft descended through 25,000 feet, the cabin pressure adjusted with a soft hiss. The passengers could feel the change, their ears popping. Sarah, the flight attendant, stood at the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. The crew is handling the situation." She didn't mention Emily, not yet. She wasn't sure the passengers could handle the truth. But the whispers continued, some filled with doubt, others with awe. And somewhere in the mix, a fragile hope had begun to spark. Back in the cockpit, Denver Center gave another instruction. "Flight 227, turn left heading 250. You're 30 miles from Denver International. Descend to 12,000. Emily repeated the instruction, her hands moving gracefully. She guided the plane into the turn, the city lights beginning to twinkle faintly on the horizon below. Mark watched her, equal parts amazed and terrified. Every decision mattered now. "Okay," he said, "when we get closer, you'll need to configure the landing. Gear flaps, speed brakes. I'll call them out, you confirm." Emily nodded. "I know the sequence. Dad drilled me on it every week." Mark almost smiled. He must have been one hell of a teacher. Emily's eyes softened for the first time since she entered the cockpit. "He was. He said one day I'd fly for real. I just didn't think it would be today." Mark's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her she shouldn't have to carry this, that the weight of 200 lives wasn't meant for small shoulders. But there was no time for speeches. Right now, she wasn't just a little girl. She was a pilot. The plane dropped below 20,000 feet. Denver loomed closer, the runway's faint lines in the distance. Adrenaline surged through Mark's veins. "All right, Emily," he said, his voice low. "This is where it gets real. You still good?" Emily's hands were steady, her eyes locked ahead. "I was born for this." Mark nodded slowly. For the first time since the crisis began, he actually believed her. The cabin lights dimmed for landing, casting the plane in a hushed glow. Behind the cockpit door, passengers held their breath. The little girl in row 9 had become the captain now. And in just a few minutes, the world would find out if she could truly fly. The Denver skyline glimmered faintly in the distance, a web of lights against the night horizon. For the passengers of Flight 227, it looked like salvation, but between them and safety stretched miles of air, shrinking altitude, and the most dangerous landing any of them had ever faced. In the cockpit, Emily sat upright in the captain's chair, her hands firm on the yoke. She looked impossibly small against the backdrop of glowing instruments, yet her presence filled the space with a strange calm. Mark sat beside her, headset on, flipping rapidly through the landing checklist. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed the adrenaline racing through his veins. "Emily," he said, "we're lined up for approach. This is it. Once we start down, there's no turning back. You ready?" Emily's lips pressed together, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I've never been more ready in my life." Mark gave a short nod, then spoke into the radio. "Denver Center, Flight 227 established on approach. Requesting emergency priority landing. The reply came almost instantly. Flight 227, you are cleared to land runway 27 left. Emergency crews are standing by. Winds 250 at 10 knots. You're cleared straight in. Emily repeated softly. 27 left, straight in, winds 250. She adjusted the heading knob and gripped the yoke tighter. Mark glanced at her again. Her voice was calm, almost clinical. She wasn't playing a part anymore. She was flying. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Fear still clung to the air, but whispers of hope spread. Parents held their children close, murmuring comfort. The elderly woman with the rosary prayed out loud now, her voice trembling but steady. Emily's mother stared blankly at the seat in front of her, her hands clenched together so tightly, her nails dug into her palms. She wanted to scream, to beg someone to stop this madness. But deep down, she knew. Her daughter was their only chance. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, walked the aisle, checking belts and securing loose items. Her voice was firm. Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for landing. Stay seated, stay calm. She didn't mention who was flying. Some truths were too heavy to share. In the cockpit, Emily's voice broke the silence. Speed 180. Flaps 5. Mark almost laughed from shock. You're calling the checklist now? She glanced at him. Isn't that what the captain does? A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. Yes, ma'am. He adjusted the flaps. The plane responded with a low mechanical whir as the wings shifted. Okay, Emily said, her eyes narrowing. Landing gear? Mark pulled the lever. With a deep thud and whine, the landing gear extended. A green light blinked on. Gear down and locked. The descent steepened. The city lights grew larger, the runway now visible like a glowing strip carved into the earth. Emily's heartbeat quickened, but her hands stayed steady. She could almost hear her father's voice guiding her. Trust the instruments. Trust yourself. Smooth and steady. At 10,000 feet, turbulence rocked the plane. The nose dipped violently, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. A scream cut through the cabin. Emily fought the controls, her small hands straining against the yoke. For a moment, the jet tilted dangerously. Mark's hand hovered, ready to take over. I've got it, Emily shouted. Her voice cracked with effort, but her determination didn't waver. She corrected gently, easing the plane back to level flight. The alarms quieted. Mark's jaw dropped. Emily. That was textbook recovery. She panted softly, her grip tightening. Dad made me practice turbulence drills every day. He said the sky always tests you before it lets you land. Mark swallowed hard. His faith in her grew with every second. At 5,000 feet, the runway lights were clear, lined up like a glowing invitation. Denver Tower's voice filled their headsets. Flight 227, you are cleared to land. Winds stable. Emergency crews in position. Emily nodded. Cleared to land. Mark called out. Final approach checklist. Flaps full. Speed 150. Emily eased the throttles back, her brow furrowed in concentration. The engines whined down, the nose dipping smoothly. Keep her steady, Mark urged. I am, Emily whispered. In the cabin, every passenger was silent now. Eyes were closed, lips moved in prayer, hands clutched tightly. Even the skeptical businessman in row 7 stared forward, pale and rigid. The entire cabin seemed to lean together, united in one fragile hope. That little girl can do it. At 2,000 feet, the ground loomed close. Lights streaked past. The runway stretched wide ahead. Mark's voice was low, urgent. This is it, Emily. Keep the nose level. Small corrections. Don't fight it, Emily nodded. Her lips moved soundlessly, whispering words only she could hear. Maybe they were prayers. Maybe they were her father's lessons. The jet rocked slightly in crosswind. Emily corrected. The yoke trembled in her hands, heavy, resisting her. She pulled gently, aligning the plane. 500 feet, Mark called. Emily's breath came shallow. I see it. 300. Her hands tightened. Sweat trickled down her temple. 200. Steady, Emily, steady. Her small voice broke through the tension. I can do this. I will do this. At 100 feet, alarms blared. The plane was descending too fast. Mark's heart jumped. Pull up slightly. He shouted. Emily gritted her teeth, tugging gently. The nose lifted. The descent slowed. 50 feet. The runway filled the windshield. The lights streaked brighter, closer. Emily held her breath. 30, 20, 10. The wheels slammed down. The cabin shook violently as the landing gear absorbed the impact. The plane bounced once, then slammed again, sparks briefly lighting the night. Gasps erupted in the cabin. Emily clutched the yoke, her eyes fierce. Speed brakes. Mark deployed them instantly. The roar of the engines reversed, the screech of wheels deafening. The jet barreled down the runway, smoke rising from the tires. For a terrifying few seconds, it seemed like they wouldn't stop. The runway lights blurred past. Passengers screamed, bracing for the worst. Then, slowly, the speed bled away. The plane lurched, screeched, and finally, mercifully, rolled to a halt. Silence. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then the cabin erupted in cheers, cries, and applause so loud it shook the fuselage. Emily leaned back in the seat, her hands trembling for the first time. Her chest heaved with exhaustion. She looked at Mark, who was staring at her in disbelief. You just landed a commercial jet," he whispered. Emily smiled faintly, her eyes wet. "I told you I could fly." The cabin of Flight 227 erupted with noise that felt like the release of a century's worth of tension. Passengers clapped, screamed, and hugged one another, tears streaming down faces that had been pale and anxious just moments before. The heavy hum of the engines gave way to the soft hiss of brakes, the final settling of a plane that had been guided by the unlikeliest of pilots. Emily's mother pressed her hands to her face, shaking with relief. "Oh, Emily. Oh, my baby," she whispered, voice breaking. She pulled her daughter close, holding her tightly as if she could shield her from the terror that had been endured. Emily hugged her back, exhausted but glowing with pride. "We did it, Mom," she murmured softly. "We really did it." Mark leaned back in his seat, his hands still shaking. He looked at Emily with awe. I don't know what to say. You just landed a plane. A full commercial jet. People are alive because of you." Emily's small hands clutched her toy plane. "I just did what Dad taught me," she said quietly, her voice trembling with fatigue. "Unbelievable," Mark breathed. "I've flown with co-pilots for years, and I've never seen anyone handle it like that. Not even the most seasoned pilots." The paramedic nodded from the cockpit doorway, exhausted but smiling. "You saved lives tonight, young lady. You saved all of them." Down in the cabin, the passengers were still shaking off the shock. Some knelt and prayed. Others hugged strangers, their fear transmuted into gratitude. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, walked the aisles, calming cries and answering questions. The co-pilot and the child handled it. "The captain is receiving medical care. Everyone is safe," she said gently. Passengers stared at her in disbelief. A child had flown the plane? Many were incredulous. Some were overwhelmed with gratitude. Mothers held children close, whispering prayers of thanks, while elderly passengers shook their heads in awe. In row 9, Emily's toy plane rested on the seat beside her. She stroked it gently, her small fingers tracing the wings. It had been her constant companion, her guide, and tonight it had been a symbol of courage, determination, and hope. Her mother leaned close, voice soft. "Everyone's going to want to know about this. You're a hero, Emily." Emily looked down, shyly but proudly. I just did what Dad said to do if something went wrong. I didn't think I was a hero." Her mother's eyes glistened. "You are. And they'll never forget it." On the tarmac, emergency vehicles surrounded the plane. Fire trucks and ambulances were standing by, engines still running, lights flashing. Passengers filed off the plane in small groups, their legs unsteady, their faces etched with disbelief and gratitude. Some laughed nervously. Others wept. News crews were already starting to gather, cameras rolling, microphones at the ready. Emily walked carefully, holding her mother's hand. Every step she took felt surreal. People stared, whispering and pointing. Whispers of "the little girl who saved the plane" traveled quickly across the tarmac. Mark followed behind, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know how she did it," he murmured to the paramedic. "I've seen emergencies, but nothing like this. Nothing. Some people are born for moments like these," the paramedic said softly. Soon, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed as microphones were thrust forward. Emily, still small and tired, was lifted gently by her mother to face the reporters. Her wide eyes looked into the sea of cameras. "Emily," one reporter asked, voice urgent and breathless, "how did it feel to land the plane?" Emily paused for a moment. She remembered the hum of engines, the beeping instruments, the faces of passengers pressed into their seats, the whispered prayers, and her father's calm voice in her memory. I just did what my dad taught me," she said simply. "I didn't think about being scared. I just focused on flying." The reporters exchanged glances. That simple answer, unembellished, sincere, and impossibly brave, captured the world's attention. News outlets ran footage almost immediately. The passengers hugging, the lights of Denver shining under the calm night sky, and the little girl in a captain's chair, calm as the instruments beneath her hands. Experts marveled at the audacity and skill, describing the situation as unprecedented and miraculous. Social media exploded with messages of awe. Hashtags like #GirlPilot and #Flight227 trending globally within hours. Emily's story transcended disbelief. She became more than a child who had flown a plane. She became a symbol of courage, of composure in the face of terror, and of the power of preparation and knowledge. At the hospital, the captain was stable, recovering from his medical emergency. Doctors praised Mark and Emily's quick thinking, acknowledging that without their combined efforts, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Later, Emily sat quietly beside her mother, still holding her toy plane. Mark entered the room, his uniform slightly rumpled, but a wide smile on his face. "You did it," he said softly. "You actually did it." Emily smiled faintly. "I told you I could fly," Mark laughed, shaking his head. "I don't think anyone in history has ever heard that line in a cockpit. But I believe it. I know it." Her mother wrapped an arm around her shoulder. "You're our miracle, Emily, and everyone out there will know it soon." Emily looked out the hospital window, thinking about the hundreds of people on Flight 227, safe because of her. She felt exhausted, yes, but also a quiet pride that filled her chest. She remembered her father's words, "One day you'll surprise the world." Tonight she had. In the following days, Emily was celebrated worldwide. News anchors featured her story. Airlines and aviation schools honored her, and social media exploded with admiration. She received letters from pilots, presidents, and children inspired by her bravery. Yet for Emily, the reward was simple, knowing she had saved lives. She continued to practice on her flight simulator, quietly preparing for the day she could fly again, not for fame, not for recognition, but for the pure love of flight her father had instilled in her. Mark continued to fly commercial flights, often recounting the story of the night a little girl saved a plane, inspiring passengers and crew alike with the reminder that courage can come from the most unexpected places. Emily's story became a legend, not because she was the smallest or the youngest, but because she was fearless, prepared, and willing to step up when the world needed her most. And somewhere, watching from the heavens, her father smiled, knowing she had truly flown.